The absolute worst part of it, the thing that haunts me in the dead of night when the city outside my window finally goes quiet, wasn't the feeling of the van's suspension dipping, as if someone had just climbed in beside me. It wasn't the whisper-soft sigh I'd hear over the engine's drone, or the slow, rhythmic tapping that started on the inside of the passenger window. It wasn't even the sight of the seat cushion compressing under the weight of a body that wasn't there. The worst part was the silence that always followed. A heavy, listening silence that pressed in from all sides, a silence that knew I was there and was waiting for me to look. I never should have looked. Before all this, my life was built on a foundation of silence and routine, and I liked it that way. My name is Mark, and for about 3 years I was a long-haul medical courier. It's not a job most people think about. You see a plain white cargo van on the highway at 3 in the morning, you probably don't give it a second thought. But inside, I was carrying time-sensitive, life-or-death materials. Blood samples for rare testing, organs for transplant on ice, specialized pharmaceuticals that had to be kept at a precise temperature. My route was one of the longest and most isolated in the lower 48, a 500-mile stretch of U.S. Route 50, cutting straight through the heart of Nevada. They call it the loneliest road in America. They aren't lying. I took the job after a particularly messy divorce. I was living in Reno and my life had become loud. Loud arguments, loud accusations, the loud, slamming door of my own apartment as my life imploded. I craved quiet. I craved space. The job offered both in spades. My shift started just as the sun began to bleed away behind the Sierras. I'd pick up my cargo from a regional medical center in Reno, check the manifests, secure the coolers in the back of the van, and then I'd just drive east into the Great Basin Desert. For the first year, it was exactly what I needed. It was meditative. There's a unique kind of peace you can only find in that much emptiness. The sheer scale of the landscape has a way of putting your own problems into perspective. Out there, the world is stripped down to its essential components: the black ribbon of asphalt, the pale gray sagebrush stretching to the horizon, and a sky so vast and dark it felt like you could fall right into it. The stars weren't just dots. They were a brilliant, shimmering dust field, the Milky Way a visible cloud from one end of the sky to the other. I'd watch the moon rise over distant, barren mountain ranges that looked like the spine of some ancient, sleeping beast. My van was my sanctuary, a 2018 Ford Transit. It was meticulously maintained, a sterile, functional space. The driver's area was my domain. I had my thermos of black coffee in the cup holder, a stack of worn-out paperbacks on the passenger seat, and a satellite radio that was my only real companion. I'd listen to late-night talk shows, long interviews with scientists or historians, anything to keep my mind occupied without being distracting. The steady hum of the engine, the rumble of the tires on pavement, the faint, high-pitched whine of the refrigeration unit in the back, those were the sounds of my life. The miles would just melt away. I'd drive for hours, sometimes seeing only a handful of other headlights, ghostly pairs of lights approaching from an impossible distance, passing in a brief whoosh of wind and then disappearing behind me, leaving me alone again. It was a predictable, solitary existence. It was safe. The first time it happened, it was so small, so insignificant that I barely registered it. I was about 3 months into my second year on the route, maybe 200 miles east of Reno. It was a clear, cold night, the kind where the stars seem sharp enough to cut you. I was cruising at a steady 70 miles an hour, listening to some guy talk about the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies. And then I felt it. A sudden, distinct dip in the van's suspension, localized entirely on the front passenger side. It was exactly the same feeling as when someone gets into a car, a slight lurch and settling of the springs. My heart gave a little jolt of adrenaline, the kind you get when a deer is about to jump out in front of you. I instinctively glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, of course. My worn copy of a Carl Hiaasen novel was sitting right where I'd left it, next to my route clipboard. I checked the rearview mirror. Nothing but miles of empty, moonlit road behind me. I looked at the passenger side wing mirror. just the silver flank of the van and the blur of the white line on the shoulder. The feeling was gone as quickly as it came. The van felt level again. "Pothole," I mumbled to myself, my voice sounding rough in the quiet cab, but it hadn't felt like a pothole. A pothole is a jarring, violent bang that shudders through the whole frame. This was a soft, yielding compression, like taking on weight. I shook my head, took a long sip of coffee, and turned the radio up a little louder. It was the road. 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, just staring at a hypnotic stretch of asphalt. The mind plays tricks. Fatigue does strange things. I dismissed it. It was the only rational thing to do. A few weeks passed, nothing out of the ordinary. The memory of that little incident faded, buried under thousands of miles of routine. Then the sound started. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like the sound of a paper bag being crumpled. It seemed to be coming from the passenger footwell. I'd lean over while driving, trying to see if a piece of trash had gotten caught in the air vent. I'd find nothing. It would happen sporadically. A dry, papery whisper that was almost, but not quite, covered by the noise of the road. One night I was convinced it was the map I kept on the passenger seat. I tucked it into the glove compartment, latched it shut, and felt a ridiculous sense of satisfaction. Problem solved. A few miles later I heard it again. A faint, crisp rustle. My blood ran cold. I pulled the van over onto the gravel shoulder, the silence of the desert rushing in the moment I killed the engine. I turned on the cab light and searched every inch of the passenger side. Under the seat, in the door pocket, the glove compartment again. Nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a stray leaf. Just the clean, factory-molded plastic and upholstery. I sat there for 10 minutes, listening to my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, feeling foolish and spooked all at once. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the feeling of being watched now prickling the back of my neck. The incidents began to stack up, each one a little stranger, a little harder to explain away. The feeling of the van dipping happened again, twice in 1 week. The second time, the feeling lingered for a good 5 or 6 seconds before it vanished. I felt the right side of the van riding lower, and I could have sworn I had to correct the steering just a little to the left to compensate. I told myself it was a slow leak in the tire. The next morning at a truck stop in Ely, I checked the pressure on all 4 tires. They were perfect. Then came the visual flickers. It was always in my peripheral vision, always in the passenger side wing mirror. I'd be staring straight ahead, my eyes locked on the vanishing point of the highway, and I'd catch a flash of movement in the mirror. A dark shape, humanoid but indistinct, standing by the side of the road, right where the mirror's view was about to leave it behind. My head would snap to the mirror, my heart pounding, but there would be nothing there. Just the endless sagebrush. The first time I slammed on my brakes, thinking I'd almost hit someone. I even reversed the van 100 feet, my high beams cutting a stark white path through the darkness. There were no footprints in the dust on the shoulder. There was no one. There was nothing. This happened more and more frequently. It was never a clear image. It was always a suggestion, a trick of the light, a blur of motion that my tired brain was struggling to process. But it was consistent. It was always a tall, dark shape, and it was always on the right side of the road. I started to develop a phobia of that mirror. I would try to drive without looking at it, relying only on my rear view and my driver's side mirror. But it was a conscious, difficult effort. My eyes would be drawn to it against my will, scanning for that flicker of movement I both dreaded and, in a strange way, expected to see. My carefully constructed peace was gone. The van was no longer my sanctuary. It was a cage, one I had to lock myself in for 10 hours a night. The silence I had once craved was now my enemy. It was a canvas onto which my fear painted sounds and shapes. I started blasting music, angry rock or frantic electronic stuff, anything with a driving beat that could drown out the silence and the whispers. But the quiet always found a way back in the space between songs, in the moments I'd turn the volume down to listen for the engine. And in those moments, I'd sometimes hear it. A soft exhalation of breath, seemingly right next to my ear. so faint I could never be sure if I'd actually heard it or just imagined it. I was getting worn down. I wasn't sleeping well during the day. I'd lie in my bed in my small Reno apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun, and I'd just stare at the ceiling, my mind replaying every little incident from the night before. Was I losing my mind? Was this the price of solitude? I'd heard stories about long-haul drivers, about highway hypnosis, about people seeing things after too many hours on the road. I tried to convince myself that's all this was. A textbook case of sensory deprivation and fatigue. So I fought back with logic. I started a log. In a small notebook, I'd write down date, time, and mile marker of every strange occurrence. I thought that by documenting it, I could find a pattern, something predictable and therefore explainable. A certain time of night, a specific stretch of road, but there was no pattern. The events were random, happening on different nights at different locations, under different weather conditions. The log didn't bring clarity. It just became a terrifying catalog of my own perceived insanity. The psychological toll was becoming immense. I grew paranoid. Before every shift, I would conduct a ritualistic search of the van. I'd open every compartment, look under the seats, even check the cargo area as if I expected to find someone hiding there. I started talking to myself while driving, carrying on long, one-sided conversations, just to fill the quiet and prove that my voice was the only one in the cab. I'd ask questions and then answer them. See that ridge over there? Looks like a sleeping giant, doesn't it? Yeah, I guess it does. It felt crazy, but it was better than the listening silence. Fear was a physical thing now, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in my chest. My appetite was gone. My hands had a slight but persistent tremor. I was chugging coffee and energy drinks at a rate that made my heart feel like it was tap dancing against my ribs. I thought about quitting. I looked at job postings for warehouse work, delivery gigs within the city, anything that would take me off that lonely road. But I hesitated. What would I say? I'm quitting because I think my van is haunted. They'd laugh me out of the office. And a stubborn, foolish part of me didn't want to let it win. Running felt like admitting I was crazy. If I could just get through it, if I could just prove to myself that it was all in my head, then I could go back to normal. The turning point, the moment I knew this was not just in my head, happened on a Tuesday night in late October. The air had turned cold, and the wind was howling across the desert flats, kicking up dust that swirled in my headlights. I was in one of the most desolate sections of the route, 100-mile straightaway between Austin and Eureka. It was a bit past 2 a.m. I had the heater blasting, but a distinct chill seemed to be emanating from the passenger side of the cab. I could feel it on my right arm, a damp cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. And then for the first time I smelled something. It was faint but unmistakable. The smell of damp earth and decay, like wet leaves rotting on a forest floor. It was a smell that had no place in the dry, high desert. It was thick, heavy, and cloying. I cracked my window, letting the frigid desert air whip through the cab, but the smell lingered, concentrated on the passenger side. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "What do you want?" I whispered into the darkness. The only answer was the howl of the wind. I stared resolutely ahead, focusing on the hypnotic repetition of the dashed white lines. My eyes started to water from the strain. Then I glanced down. In the faint, greenish glow from the dashboard instruments, I saw it. An indentation on the passenger seat cushion. It was deep, perfectly defined, the exact shape a person would make if they were sitting there. The fabric was pulled taut around the edges of the depression. I could see the foam underneath being compressed by an invisible, significant weight. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My entire universe shrank to that impossible sight. It was there. It was real. Something was sitting in my van. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my truck drifting slightly over the center line before the rumble strip jolted me back to awareness. I jerked the wheel, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I didn't dare look again. I fixed my eyes on the road, my vision tunneling. I was still a good hour and a half from Eureka, the nearest pinprick of light and life. An hour and a half with this thing sitting next to me. The smell of damp earth was stronger now. The cold was so intense it felt like it was seeping into my bones. And then the tapping started. Tap. A single, soft sound against the passenger window. I flinched so hard I nearly drove off the road. Tap, tap. It was quiet but clear. It was precise. And it was coming from the inside. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a pebble. It was the sound of a fingernail deliberately striking the glass, a patient, rhythmic summons for my attention. Tap, tap, tap. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot against my cold skin. A low, guttural sound of pure terror escaped my throat. I wanted to scream, to floor it, to stop and run out into the desert, but I was paralyzed. My hands were locked on the wheel, my foot frozen on the accelerator. All I could do was drive and listen to that horrifying, methodical tapping. It went on for miles, an eternity of tap, 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 a maddening interpret to the drone of the engine. I was coming apart. My sanity was fraying like a worn rope, strand by strand. I was begging, pleading in my mind. Please just leave me alone. Please just go. And then a new sound. A sound that shattered the last vestiges of my composure. Click. It was a small, mechanical sound. A sound I heard every single day. A sound I had never, ever heard from that side of the van when I was alone. Clack. The sound of the seatbelt buckle being fastened. That was it. The rope snapped. A raw animal scream tore out of my lungs. I slammed on the brakes with all my might. The tires shrieked in protest, the van fishtailing wildly on the empty highway before shuddering to a violent halt. The coolers in the back crashed against the bulkhead. The world went silent except for the frantic, ragged sound of my own breathing. I didn't think. I acted on pure, primal instinct. I unbuckled my seatbelt, threw my door open, and scrambled out of the van. I fell to my knees on the cold, rough asphalt, gasping for the night air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. The wind whipped at my clothes, cold and indifferent. For a long minute, I just knelt there in the middle of the loneliest road in America, my headlights cutting two perfect, lonely beams into the infinite darkness. I was waiting for a door to open, for a shape to emerge, for anything. Nothing happened. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. My legs felt like jelly. I forced myself to look at the passenger side of the van. The door was closed. The window was empty. With a sense of dread so profound it made me nauseous, I crept around the front of the van, staying in the wash of the headlights. I peered through the passenger window. The seat was empty. The seatbelt was retracted, resting in its normal position against the door frame. The indentation on the cushion was gone. The fabric was smooth, undisturbed. It was as if nothing had ever been there. I stood there for a long time, trembling in the wind, a solitary figure illuminated in a sea of darkness. I was completely, utterly alone. But the feeling of being watched, of a cold, patient intelligence observing me from the shadows just beyond the reach of my lights, was more powerful than it had ever been. It knew it had broken me. I don't remember much about the rest of that drive. I know I got back in the van. I know I drove at a reckless speed, my eyes burning from staring into the darkness, never once glancing at the passenger seat. I made it to Eureka, dropped off my delivery at the small clinic there, my hands shaking so badly I could barely sign the paperwork. The nurse on duty asked if I was okay. I think I just nodded. I drove to the next town, Ely, parked in the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour casino, and sat there in my driver's seat until the sun came up, watching people come and go, needing the presence of other human beings to feel real. That morning I called my dispatcher from a payphone. I told him I was sick. I told him I quit. I didn't give a reason. I couldn't. I drove the van back to the depot in Reno, left the keys on the counter and walked away. I never looked back. I sold my car. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone in a vehicle ever again. Within a month, I had packed up my small apartment and moved. I chose a big city on the East Coast, a place as far from the vast, empty deserts of Nevada as I could get. I thought the noise, the crowds, the constant light would be my shield. I thought I could drown the memory of the silence. I was wrong. It's been 5 years. I have a job in a warehouse, a noisy, bustling place. I live in a small apartment on a busy street where the sound of sirens and traffic is a constant lullaby. I ride the subway, the bus. I am surrounded by people almost every waking moment, but the feeling has never completely gone away. It followed me, or maybe it was never on the road in the first place. Maybe it was in me all along. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my couch late at night, I'll feel the cushion beside me dip just for a second. In a crowded subway car, I'll feel a sudden, intense pocket of cold right next to me. I'll catch a flicker of a tall, dark shape in the reflection of a storefront window, a shape that vanishes when I turn to look. I'll be in my own kitchen and for a split second, I'll catch the faint, phantom smell of damp earth. I've never told anyone the full story. Not my doctor, not the therapist I saw for a while. How do you explain a horror that has no substance? How do you describe a presence that is defined only by its absence? They would give it a name: stress-induced psychosis, complex post-traumatic stress. They would give me pills, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The loneliest road in America isn't in Nevada. It's the one you walk every day after something like that happens. A road where you're constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly checking the mirrors, terrified F the empty space beside you. Because you know, with a certainty that chills you to your very soul, that even when no one is there, you are not alone. And you know that it's just sitting there, silent and patient, waiting for you to look.